I want to be like that. And sometimes you think, wow, I kind of hate them because they're so far above what you are, and it's kind of can be discouraging. One thing about it, even though we might be amateurs at a lot of things, God has given us talents to excel at other things. There's many times where your best skill becomes your occupation. It's called making a living. And some define a professional as someone who makes a living at something. I think there's more to it than that. It's not just about making money at it. Olympic athletes might get money later on, but for now, from what I understand, all the training and everything, having to hire a trainer and all the equipment that goes with their skill, it costs them a lot of money. I know people who I also consider professional moms and dads. They excel at it. In fact, they're a lot like Olympic athletes. They might get money later on, but more than likely it's just costing them money right now. But being a professional is a full-out effort. Every day is about their profession. I imagine you've heard stories of people training and how early they get up, and it's their whole lives are about it. We all have our hobbies and our skills, but it's not the same thing. We might be better than most at certain things, but not totally dedicated to it like that. And it might come up in conversation. You're talking about something you like to do, and it may very well come up, and you'd say, well, I'm an amateur, but I'm not a professional. Something that I do for fun. I really love to do it, but I don't take it too seriously. It's not my life. Better than most, but not really dedicated to it. And of course, the reason I bring this up is it's so easy to approach Christianity this way, to think of it as having at least two levels. Maybe in some people's minds it's even more complicated than that. But I do think we think of Christianity that way. There's the amateurs, and then there's the professionals. For instance, it can kind of surface in innocent phrases. In conversation you might say, well, if you ask most people, say, yeah, I'm a Christian. And if you ask them, are you a disciple? There would be some hesitation there. What do you mean by disciple? Well, by definition, that would be somebody who's completely devoted to God and who tries to live like Jesus did, except all the time, every day, not just, Sundays and stuff. And it would be easy to hesitate and say, well, I'm just a Christian, I'm not a disciple. I'm just an amateur, I'm not a professional at this. Better than most, but not totally dedicated to it. So I believe there's a common misunderstanding about Christianity. We think there are different levels along the lines of professionals and amateurs, and we all serve the church in different ways. If you go look at 1 Corinthians 12:4, I want to be up front. I realize everybody has different ways that they add to the work of the church. This is made very clear in Scripture, 1 Corinthians 12, verse 4. And this is what makes humanity interesting, is we all have different abilities. Here's how God puts it in 1 Corinthians 12, starting with verse 4. Now there are varieties of gifts, but the same Spirit, and there are varieties of ministries, and the same Lord. There are varieties of effects, but the same God who works all things in all persons. So there are different roles, but not different levels. Every Christian is a vital part. In fact, some who seem less important, actually Scripture addresses this, some who seem less important are actually more important than you realize. 1 Corinthians 12, 22. And notice that it's easy for everybody to miss the point on this. 1 Corinthians 12, 22. On the contrary, it is much truer that the members of the body which seem to be weaker are necessary, and those members of the body which we deem less honorable, on these we bestow more abundant honor, and our less presentable members become much more presentable. God is making an analogy here, I'm sure you're familiar with it, where the church is compared to a human body. And he does that for a reason. Every part is essential. There are no parts that are occasionally or slightly important. You might consider your little toe. You pick which foot. You got a little toe, probably haven't thought about it for days. And it might seem unimportant to you, but it's a professional part of your body. I think it might help to think of it that way. It's not occasionally attached to you. If you think your little toe is not important, you would, see how you feel if we were to take it off. It would suddenly become very important to you. When it comes to the church, there are no amateurs. There are only professionals. They're also known as disciples. A disciple is not an extra strong Christian. A disciple is simply a Christian. They're interchangeable terms. Any Christian is a disciple. That's the only arrangement. We just read together, Rocky read this for us, Acts 11:26 at the end. We kind of focus on the city. You say, when were they first called Christians? Well, Antioch, but notice how it's put. The disciples were first called Christians in Antioch. So initially they were known as disciples. Nothing changed except that they were also known as Christians. There are strong and weak Christians, and probably you could even argue that all of us are strong and weak in certain areas, and there are old and young Christians, but there's no part-time or semi-pro Christians. We sometimes hear different things that indicate this kind of belief in levels, and it's kind of like when you say, well, I'm going to church. You could say, well, technically you're not going to church, you are the church. It might fall under that category, but sometimes you'll hear somebody say, well, he's a Christian and he's active in the church. Kind of an innocent sounding phrase, but kind of misleading. It's kind of like saying he's a professional mechanic and he works on engines sometimes. If you're a mechanic, that just kind of implies you work on engines. And if you're a Christian, that implies you're active in the church. They just go together. Not necessarily, of course, in the church building, but you're active as a saved soul doing something about that fact. You don't just talk about Christianity, you live it, you're a professional. Saying someone is a Christian, but they're not active in the church, it's like saying, I have a little toe, but it keeps coming off. Say, no, I don't think it's your little toe anymore. You might have to break it to them that, that toe is not really part of anything that has to do with you. And it's an easy mistake to make, to think that following Jesus is the same as being in the vicinity of Jesus. You can see God making this distinction in Luke 7. We actually looked at this a few weeks ago. Remember when Jesus was approaching the town of Nain and that funeral was coming out? And Luke 7, verse 11, I think it's interesting that God makes a distinction of two groups, two kinds of people following Jesus in that group. Luke 7, verse 11 says, soon afterwards, he went to a city called Nain, and notice this, and his disciples were going along with him, accompanied by a large crowd. And I remember reading and thinking that, wow, I wonder if it's possible that I'm just part of that crowd. See, when you saw Jesus back then, you were actually looking at two kinds of people in that crowd. There were disciples, and then there was the crowd. Well, how could you tell the difference? Well, I don't know how much worth to give this, but notice the verbs here. The disciples were going along, the crowd accompanied. Maybe it's possible to accompany Jesus without following him, without being changed. Just kind of be in the vicinity to see what's going on, but not really involved. Just kind of keeping company with him. The definition of a disciple is someone who follows someone's teachings. Not just a student, not just a pupil, but someone who imitates the teacher. If a Christian is a disciple, a Christian is someone who imitates the teacher. He doesn't just talk about the teacher or just admire the teacher or sing about the teacher. He becomes more and more like the teacher. I bet you probably one of the best ways to express this, I bet all of us as you get older, you begin to see things in yourself and you think, my dad does this. My mom says that. You see certain gestures and phrases that your parents did, and it's not like you sat down and said, I'm going to start saying and doing these things. You just picked it up, and you start finding your parents in the things that you do and in the things that you say. Same mannerisms, things like that. You probably had people say that to you and say, oh, that reminds me of your dad or your mom. And it's because you lived with them all the time and you interacted with them and you picked that up. You became more and more like them. If someone knew your parents and then met you, they could tell, you belong to them. The way that you think and act, I can tell you're part of them. And the same is true back then. If you talk to a disciple, they'd be able to say, I know who your teacher is. I can tell by the way that you talk, what you say, and what you're doing. So this is a hard truth. When it comes to Christianity, there are only disciples. There is no other arrangement. Luke 9:23. Jesus kind of lays out the plan for anybody who wants to follow him, and it's very famous, but it's so easy for me to kind of miss the depth of what he's saying. Luke 9, starting with verse 23. And he was saying to them all, if anyone wishes to come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me. For whoever wishes to save his life will lose it. But whoever loses his life for my sake, he is the one who will save it. And notice it's if anyone wishes. It's the only program. Notice the word whoever. Whoever wishes to save his life. And it's a daily thing of taking up the cross. There's no position open or available where you can sort of deny yourself or sporadically carry the cross. The only opening is denying yourself and taking up the cross daily. That's the only arrangement. These are the terms for everyone, not just for the extra bonus religious people. But there's a reason that we all want levels. If there's only one level, that leads to a word we don't want to hear: commitment. Being a Christian requires commitment. At the Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs, I don't know if they still do this or not, but at least when my cousin was there, they would do something kind of interesting. Every year they'd have a graduation, and you're probably well aware it's 4 years of college, but very intense. Not everybody makes it. In fact, I think it's 1 out of 3 do not complete the courses there. And when they do the graduation, the day of graduation, I don't know if you've ever been to an Air Force Academy graduation, they list all the names. And from what I understand, at least they did this back then, they'd list all the names in the order of their GPA. So, the guy who had the best GPA was at the top of the list, and then it went down the list. And, sure enough, there's the guy at the very end. He scraped by. But what they would do, at least back then, is all the members of the class, it could be a couple hundred guys, they'd each put in $1. I guess it was a silver dollar. And then whoever successfully graduated at the bottom of the list, he was called Tail End Charlie. And he got the money. It's like, congratulations for coming in dead last. I always felt sorry for second to the end tail Charlie. That guy's, not only was he near the bottom, but he didn't get any money either. But that's not how Christianity works. We're made perfect by Jesus. There's no GPA or anything like that. And we don't set out to scrape by. That's not how it works. We're all in. All of us are all in. Baptism is an over-the-top victory. Romans 8:37 describes it this way: but in all these things we overwhelmingly conquer through him who loved us. To overwhelmingly conquer. Anyone who sets out after that to just scrape by does not have a grasp of the situation. After being overwhelmingly rescued, there's no room for partial commitment. Can you imagine going to a wedding and the preacher turns to the groom and says, do you promise to live together in holy matrimony? Do you vow to love her, comfort her, honor her, and keep her in sickness and in health, and forsaking all others, be joined only with her so long as you both shall live? And he says, absolutely, 95% of the time. That's not going to go over for anybody. The decision to be married, there's no percentage of commitment. And the decision to be a Christian is even more serious. There's only one version of Christianity. It's 100%. Anything else is not Christianity. God must come before all other things, before everyone and everything in your life. Even if God comes in a close second, it will hurt your connection with those things that you love and the people you love. You will be what you need to be for the people that you love if you put God first. But the price tag for Christianity is the same for everyone. It just costs you everything. There's a very short parable in Matthew 13. It's very short, and every time I read it, it's kind of a slap in the face, a good reminder. It's shocking when you realize what it's really saying. Matthew 13:44. It's very short. The kingdom of heaven is like a treasure hidden in the field, which a man found and hid again. And from joy over it, he goes and sells all that he has. He goes and sells all that he has and buys that field. The cost of the kingdom is everything. That's how much Jesus paid for it. Jesus gave up everything for the kingdom, and anyone who follows him has to do the same. For what it's worth, you get to keep your stuff. You do get to keep your stuff, but it's not yours. This can easily come across as kind of annoying, almost like the people who stop you and ask if you're happy with your cable service and you want to just leave me alone. Everything's fine. Quit messing with stuff. And I realize that. But this is not about taking things away from you. This is about emptying your life so he can fill it with better things. But we're a lot like hoarders. We have no room for anything that's truly of value. And it's hard to let go. Our lives could be so much better. And it might seem like a difficult decision, but this payoff is very, very simple. Here's John 15, verse 5. John 15, verse 5. And notice the extremes here. I am the vine, you are the branches. He who abides in me and I in him, he bears much fruit. For apart from me, you can do nothing. Very simple. You either get nothing or you get everything. There's no gray areas at all here. I found this was kind of interesting. I looked up where amateur came from, the word. I was wondering where it came from. And it comes from the word which means to love. You probably know that old song, When the Moon Hit Your Eye, like a big pizza pie. That's amore. That's where we get the word amateur, amore, or love. It's somebody who loves something. Say, yeah, I'm an amateur. I love that kind of stuff. A professional is kind of different. It means it's connected to the word to profess. And specifically has to do with professing vows. And the way it would work is when somebody was really good at something and they were skilled and they were going to make a living at it, they basically would vow to perform their skill to the highest known standard. That's what it meant to profess as a professional. I think this is kind of significant. The word Christian shows up 3 times in the New Testament. The word disciple, 270. I'm not saying that they're any different, but clearly we can't slip past that word disciple and think that there's anything less than that. There are only professionals. As one guy put it, amateur hour is over. The church is made up of disciples, people fully committed to God. They are not perfect, so if you happen to not be perfect, you are certainly welcome and in good company. But Christians are determined to go all in, 100%, and then God provides the perfect. The trick is to make sure that you're right with God. Before we sing the song, I want to make sure, as always, we want to make sure if anybody's not baptized, we hope you'll consider making that decision. Baptism is essential to your salvation. I don't know how much time is left for any of us for this world, so there's a sense of urgency. But with that same sense of urgency, I would encourage all of us to look our lives over and make sure that we haven't slipped down into a false amateur Christianity. Professional Christianity is the only kind that there is. And that's exciting because that means there's so much more that you and I could be. I appreciate the song that Brent chose that we'll be singing to encourage each other right now. It's Living for Jesus, very appropriate. And I hope you'll look at the words closely as we stand together and sing.
Living for Jesus, a life that is true, striving to please Him in all that I do.